Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to have our next session that Jeremy is going to lead us through in our racial justice training series on the adultification of Black girls and women. And so, Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us today and putting together the panel for today. And we appreciate you putting this extra session together. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, Kyle. I appreciate everybody for being here. Thank you all for joining us. This is our second to last installment in our racial justice training series and continuous learning process. I'm excited today. We're going to be speaking to Black women, that's with a capital B, talking about what it means to be Black women and reflecting on the role adultification has played in their lives. This is going to be an important conversation throughout the series. We've gotten a chance to talk to different people about different things. The last one we had was talking to young folks around why it's so important for them to be engaged in racial justice. So please turn your mics up, get your notepads and pens ready. And like always, let's stay engaged and let's learn something new today, okay? So I'm going to do this. I'm going to explain just the process for how we're going to learn today, and then I'll introduce our panelists. The first thing is, as always, these sessions are recorded, so please refrain from taking any screenshots at all. And the description for today is that negative stereotypes of Black women are mapped onto Black girls, which can lay the foundation for adultification bias. This learning panel features Black women who can speak to the impact adultification has had on their lives and provide strategies to eliminate it. During this multifaceted learning panels, participants will learn from me, listen to the panelists, and discuss how they've perpetuated and or been impacted by adultification bias. Okay, so that's our training description. As always, we're going to have some activities, some discussions, and then afterwards you'll get a reflection journal and application video. This is our community culture. It's important to remind us all every time what that community culture is, okay? This will probably be new for our panelists as well. This community culture, these principles were really taken out of years of doing conversations around race and identity, and really serve to be an important reminder every time we enter these spaces. This is a great way to keep them safe. So, as always, whenever you see some of these things, I'd like you to partner with other people in doing those things, okay? So at the top, sometimes we want to be toxically positive, okay? Wanting to say things like it's not that bad, there's always a silver lining, or there's still hope. I like to call this the motivational monster. Sometimes we want to scare away all of the deeper conversations. And whenever you're thinking to yourself, you know what, it's not that bad, ask yourself, for who? In this moment right now, whose feelings am I truly honoring? And can I do that without imposing my worldview on other people? So whenever you feel like you want to be toxically positive and shoo away all the negativity, I want to ask yourself for who, and then commit to honoring that uncomfortable moment. The next thing is, some of y'all may have some cringy comments. Listen, we're here to learn together. And we've seen in demonstration over the last couple of months how folks have said some things that were problematic, but they had an attitude of, I want to learn, okay? And so you may feel like, I want to say something, but I don't want to be seen biased or racist or ignorant. I want to encourage you not to justify. Many times when you start off by saying, I don't believe this, but other folks start thinking, I don't know, do you not believe it? And so rather than justifying it, ask the question, share the thought, and make the comment without rationalizing everything you have to say, okay? The next thing is identity mining. This is a term that I use to describe that moment when someone is in the group and they fit an identity, and someone else, maybe that has power and privilege, says, I want to hear from you, Jeremy, because you're an African-American male. That's called identity mining. The idea is you're kind of digging through folks' identities, trying to get them to speak to something. This particular training is designed to eliminate much of that, and that we've actually given the floor to folks who actually have those identities, okay? Instead, think out loud, offer up an idea, and then actually expect feedback. Last few things, power dynamics. No place here for it. Some of us have really powerful roles in the organizations that we play. Maybe our identities can be used to shift environments. What we want to do is cancel culture, right? Call out and reject those dominating ideas, expectations, and dynamics or situations explicitly. This is a accountability space. That's the only way it's going to be safe. And so if there are people in this space who are trying to wield their power to shift the conversation, I invite all of us to remind us that nope, that's not what we're doing here. We're having an equitable space where voices and identities can be shared equally. Any questions about our community culture? All right, hopefully everybody understands those. All right, here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to read the information I have on our esteemed panelists. I'll read their bios and then I'll introduce them and ask them to say what's up to everybody else in the space. First up is Tiana. All right, so Tiana identifies as a Black woman with many passions and skills. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in African American Studies from Marquette University. After graduation, Tiana served in 2 AmeriCorps programs, Public Allies, shout out to them, and local initiatives support cooperation, working with youth and assisting with community development efforts. Tiana is the Assistant Director of Service Learning at Marquette University. She is responsible for developing new community partnerships, maintaining relationships with 100 plus community partners, managing a student leader staff, and helping faculty and local organizations work towards mutually beneficial partnership. Tiana says this about what it means to be a Black woman. She says, glowing, growing, supporting, loving hard, centering my skin, centering and learning how to show up as Black woman and show up for other Black women. Being a Black woman means I am constantly reading and building with other Black women to affirm our love and our strength. It also means doing my part to protect the dignity of Black women and girls at all costs. Being a Black woman means honoring the Black woman they have come before me and seeing the genuineness of Black women and girls I come into contact with daily. She continues the history of terror that continues to be over present on Black women, causes me to be more aware of my needs and create, take up, and promote spaces where other Black women, especially young Black girls, can be their full selves. Lastly, Tiana says, being a Black woman means knowing that this society doesn't deserve Black women. Please give a warm welcome to Tiana. Thank you for being here. Speak to us, Tiana. How are you doing this morning?
What's up? Good morning. I am doing well. I'm just happy to be on the panel with Mikey and Hope. I'm just doting over them right now. What Black women do, we dote over each other. I'm just very happy to be here. I'm thankful that I'm able to participate and be on a panel with 2 other dope women. So yes, happy to be here.
Much appreciated. All right, speaking of Hope, Hope is the youth organizer at the ACLU of Wisconsin. They've worked in Mississippi at the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. There, they facilitated restorative dialogue circles in communities with racially traumatic histories and helped high school students to develop community improvement plans, some of which were presented to city officials in their communities. They have spent the past 4 years as an educator in Milwaukee Public Schools, and most recently has worked with Milwaukee Film as youth education coordinator. They graduated from the University of Mississippi with a bachelor's degree in African American Studies with an emphasis on social and political systems, writing a thesis focused on the reasons why and how Black women persist at predominantly white educational institutions. Being a Black woman means, in her own words, being a Black woman means to have access to the universe's most precious gifts. We are the innovators and the architects of the present and the future with the past as our fuel. Black women are vital for humanity's survival because they constantly push the boundaries for how things could be. Please give a warm, warm welcome to our next panelist, Hope Wilson. How you doing, Hope?
I'm doing good. I like always get anxiety when folks read those things because I'm like, ah. So thank you so much for like sharing that and reminding me of like where I come from and what I've done. But it's also like cringeworthy on this end. But I'm so happy to be here. And I share Tiana's sentiment. It's a reunion. I've worked with Tiana and Mikey before, so I'm just always excited whenever I get to see their faces here. So hi, everybody. I'm also like, I went through Teach for America, so I've gone through AmeriCorps. So I'm excited to be in this space with y'all.
Thank you, Hope. I appreciate you joining us, and we're excited to have you all share your thoughts as well. All right. And for our next panelist, we have Mikey, writer, filmmaker, educator, Black feminist, Killjoy from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Most of her work explores themes such as race, gender, sex, queerness, and religion. Mikey is the author of self-published collection of poetry titled Black Girls, Silence, and Other Things Made of God, which has been used in classrooms, workshops, and book clubs across the United States. She currently works as the community engagement and education strategist at Ubuntu Research and Evaluation, a team of unapologetic Black women working as transdisciplinary strategists committed to disrupting systemic oppression through evaluation, facilitation, and education. When Mikey grows up, she wants to be the first Black woman to receive the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. In the words of Mikey, to be a Black woman, to me, she says, means to be in a constant space of re-evaluation and evolution. Black womanhood looks and feels so many different ways. And I think, she says, that's the beauty of it. It cannot be contained to one definition, lived experience, or portrayal. Please give it up for Mikey, everybody. Mikey, how are you this morning?
I'm over the moon. I'm super geeked. This was a very like happy accident. Like I had no idea who else was going to be on the panel. So then when I got that initial email and saw everyone's names, I was like, wow, this is the best. I like texted Hope and Tiana afterwards and I was like, I see we're going to be on the same panel. So I'm just geeked to be in this space and to share and learn and grow with all of y'all. So thank you again for inviting me with some of Milwaukee's all-stars.
Nice. Thank you, Mikey. And last but certainly not least, we have our fourth panelist, y'all, and she goes by Charlene Moore. Charlene Moore has committed her life to building and sustaining grassroots leadership for change. She has a passion for community justice, which led her to co-founding Urban Underground in 2000. A nationally recognized grassroots youth development organization whose members have been at the forefront of youth-led social change in Milwaukee and the region. She is also the founding member of Youth Justice Milwaukee, which is a broad-based youth decarceration campaign advocating for the creation of community-based, family-centered, restorative programs as an alternative to locking up youth in Wisconsin. Charlene's efforts have touched the lives of countless youth, including me, and have inspired a new generation of young leaders that will carry forth the struggle for justice and equality. Charlene currently serves as Director of Youth Justice Milwaukee and Urban Underground, located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Charlene, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, everyone. Oh my gosh, I am so excited to be here, and not only to be in this space, but to be in this space with such dope women. So I am, listen, we're gonna make today an amazing conversation.
And then Charlene, can you tell us a little bit, for you, what does it mean to be a Black woman?
Ah, man. I loved what you read for some of our other panelists. And, you know, for me, I've been thinking about how to even just express this. And what comes to mind for me is to just be unapologetic, to be in a space to not have to apologize about the essence of who it is that I am. Beautiful. Right? Because, you know, as we walk into spaces where, you know, other people see us as a threat. And so, you know, for some women, for some Black women especially, we've learned to sort of pull back and to, you know, dim our light, right? So others can shine. But child, no, I have learned that, you know what, this is me. I'm gonna let my light shine so that others can see it, and I'm gonna not apologize for it.
Woo! That is good. So listen, y'all are across the state, and you can tell this panelist is on fire this morning. I almost feel bad for bringing any information at all. I kind of want to say, go ahead, y'all, and let's have it. So here's how we're going to structure today so we can make sure we get the most out of our panelists. The first thing is I'm going to share just a little bit of information here just around adultification. And they're going to be really in 3 different segments, okay? First, we're going to define adultification. Then we're going to look at some institutional statistics. And then we're going to look at actually some ways we can dismantle it. Real simple. Define it, statistical evidence, dismantle it, okay? I'll present a little bit for about 5 minutes. That's it, I promise. Then I'm going to ask a question to the panelists for them to respond to, and then the audience will get a chance to ask questions and have conversations too. So this is a 3-part, y'all. I'm going to do a little bit of talking. They're going to take the floor, and then I want you all to be prepared to ask your questions, make your comments. Please engage with that panelist. You'll get some information and conversation to help you out with the kinds of questions you want to ask, okay? So first up, let's start defining adultification. I'd like for someone in the audience to read for me this 3-part definition of adultification. Can I get the first person who'd like to volunteer?
I can read, Jeremy.
Go ahead.
The extent to which race and gender, taken together, influence our perception of Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers.
All right, can I get someone else to read the second part of the definition?
I'm happy to read it.
Go ahead.
As stated by Dr. Monique W. Morris, the assignment of more adult-like characteristics to the expressions of young Black girls. Black girls are likened more to adults than to children and are treated as if they are willfully engaging in behaviors typically expected of Black women.
And then lastly, can I get a third reader, please?
I can go. This has stripped Black girls of their childhood freedoms and renders Black girlhood interchangeable with Black womanhood.
That is a heavy, heavy definition, y'all. I'd like to hear some folks talk about what stands out to you about that definition. What comes to mind?
It strikes me that it's implied that the willfully engaging in behaviors, like little girls know that they're acting like adults and they want to act like adults when it's really adults projecting those behaviors onto those girls.
Carolyn, yeah, that willful piece is interesting, right? There's a form of bias that we talk about, which is attribution bias. And what it does is it says you begin to say to yourself why another person's acting the way that they're acting. It is rooted in your own bias and assumptions about that person. And so that willfulness speaks to, like you said, Carolyn, this idea that, yep, she's acting like that because she's trying to be grown. Interesting. Thank you. Somebody else.
Sadness and loss for these young girls.
Can you expound on that a little bit?
All of the descriptions just make me feel very sad and bring out the reality of the loss for them of their childhoods and what all of that means to them at that time and how it influences them for the rest of their lifetimes.
Wow. You know, Patty, a lot of times, depending on how a young person is brought up, they can live much of their childhood with a sense of weight on them, especially young Black children. And you don't recognize the weight until another life experience happens and you go, wow, I've been really heavy. I've been really heavy. I remember when I was younger, I went to Atlanta for the first time. And I remember seeing Black folks everywhere. And it was weird for me, and I didn't realize it was weird until I got back home to Milwaukee and realized that segregation has a weight on me that I didn't realize it had on me, right? And so some folks say it's in the air. Church folks say it's a spirit, right? The idea here is that you can feel it intergenerationally, you can feel it geographically, you can feel the weight sometimes. And young folks may not have the words to talk about what it feels like. They may not even be able to point to specific examples in life and go, yeah, that's that thing. Oftentimes we have to be educated on it. And many times that comes from our Black mothers and fathers. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Any other reflections about this particular definition?
I think too, Jeremy, that sometimes we put a lot of responsibility on our young Black girls at an early age. And this is why they act more adult-like, but they're just a kid. And then when their kid-like tendencies come out, we get disappointed because they've had more responsibility and we're not expecting them to act like the 9 or 10-year-old kid that they are, because they've taken over a lot of responsibility in the home in which the mother really should have taken over. And so therefore we expect more out of our Black girls at different age levels than they could, you know. And I can reflect back to by age 10 in my household, all 3 of the girls in that household, we were able to cook, clean, and do everything, make homemade drop biscuits, whatever, like our parents could at age 10, which I don't know, today's kids, you know, it's changed a little bit, they, you know, because they're more adults, so they tend to step out and do more. And I think that's why we have a little less respectability going on.
Ruby,
They kind of raised stuff.
Yeah, thank you. You know, you mentioned something powerful, and you mentioned some of these external factors that produce adultification in young people. One of the things that Black girls share in common with other young folks, no matter their gender, sexuality, or even their race, is that there is something called an external adultification process, right? And so things like living in poverty can create an adultification process. Things like living in single-family homes, rather it be one person, no matter the gender or identity, in that home can create more of an adultification process. Going to certain schools where there may be lackadaisical or unethical disciplinary processes can actually trigger that adultification process because children feel like they have to take care of themselves despite other adults because they may not feel safe in those academic spaces. That can create and contribute to adultification processes too. So one of the things that I find powerful is that many times as adults, we don't recognize until after we've become much older potentially, how our lives are shaping the lives of young people. And many times, external consequences, external factors contribute to young folks feeling like they have to be older, understanding things that are far beyond the need of their years. And those things can also and sometimes be rooted in the historical disenfranchisement, divestment of Black communities as well. That's good, y'all. All right, any other reflections? All right, let's keep moving. So this is a report that came out in around 2017. It's called Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls in Childhood. And so this report is actually going to be in your reflection journal. I'd like you all to reference it if you would like to as well. But what I've done is I read through the thing, and what I did was pull out some highlights that we're going to use to have our first conversation. We're going to go a little bit deeper in defining adultification bias from this particular report. So just to start, in this report, what they did was they interviewed adults, a relatively small sample of adults, and they looked at their perception of Black girls, right? And the questionnaire that they used asked the participants to respond to inquiries for each age bracket, including the following, okay? How often do Black or white, they call them females in the report, take on adult responsibilities? seem older than their age, need to be supported, need to be comforted. How independent are Black or white females, and how knowledgeable are Black and white females about sex? Once again, the idea for this report is asking just these 6 questions is to really try and gauge how much of a perception people have about Black girls as opposed to white girls. So those are the questions they had to respond to in the report. Few things about it is that they surveyed 325 adults from various racial and ethnic backgrounds and different educational levels. Participants completed a 9-item questionnaire. For each item, they used the following point scale: not at all, a little, undecided somewhat, and a great deal. And then lastly, the whole purpose was to determine whether adults assign Black girls qualities that render them more like adults and less innocent than their white peers. To do so, they adapted the scale by Galt and colleagues. So here's the results. Beginning as early as 5, y'all. 5. Black girls were more likely to be viewed as behaving and seeming older than their stated age, more knowledgeable about adult topics, including sex, and more likely to take on adult roles and responsibilities than what would have been expected for their age. Okay, so what they're saying here is that based off that report, the people who answered those questions deemed Black girls more likely to be viewed as behaving seeming older than their stated age, more knowledgeable about adult topics, including sex, and more likely to take on adult roles and responsibilities. This is the perception based off of the data. The results suggest that Black girls are viewed as more adults than their white peers at almost all stages of childhood, beginning most significantly at age 5, peaking during the ages of 10 and 14, and continuing during the ages of 15 and 19. Responses revealed in particular that participants perceived Black girls as needing less protection and nurturing than white girls, and that Black girls were perceived to know more about adult topics and are more knowledgeable about sex than their white peers. Okay? So when we think about the historical context of our biases and microaggressions, and even lived experience with racism, we understand that many of these perceptions around Black girls is historically rooted. Many times Black girls grow up receiving messages about what it means to be a Black girl. Here is an excerpt from that report from particularly a Black woman. It says, just because they look older, just because they're slightly more mature, you can expect more out of this 7-year-old African-American Black girl as you can out of this Caucasian 7-year-old. They're both 7. They both have the same brain development. One may have seen more things than the other. I think that's what gets lost, okay? And so there's an excerpt from that Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequalities, the same report from that data. So now that is a little bit about how adultification has been defined and even measured as well. And now that you've got an excerpt from a Black woman in that report, I want you all to hear from Black women in this training. So here's our first question for our Black woman panelists. What messages did you receive about what it means to be a Black girl, both positive and or negative? What messages did you receive about what it means to be a Black girl? All right, who'd like to go first?
This is Charlene. I'll actually start first. I've been thinking about this question, and it's interesting because I come from a different perspective. And so I'll talk about it from 2 different lenses. So I was born and raised in Jamaica. I moved to the States when I was 6 years old. And Jamaica is a country that everywhere you go, everybody looks like me. And so the images of, and the sort of positive affirmation just as a child that I received connected, I had more of a connection to that. However, when I moved to the States, things, drastically changed because when we went to the store to look for Barbie dolls, the
Uh-oh.
Barbie dolls never looked like me. So I grew up during that era. This is the 80s that we're talking about, that, even when Cabbage Patch dolls, for those, that were born around, I'm aging myself, those that were around that time that had Cabbage Patch dolls.
Yeah.
At that time, there were very few, Cabbage Patch dolls of color. The mainstream was always white images, white toys, white dolls. And, and I loved Barbie dolls. I love my Ken dolls. I love my Barbie dolls. And I remember not having not one doll of color. And so that messaging for me, as far as, what it means to be a Black girl, that notion of affirming who I was, was based on, light skin, light eyes, straight hair.
Colorism.
That was what it was really centered around. And, so when we would play, we would put a towel on our hair, so that we could give the perception of having long hair, right? And again, it just, my Blackness was, as a woman, wasn't really affirmed until well into my adulthood. And so it's just interesting as I think back and how I changed that for, I now have a Black daughter, and how we're very intentional about the books that we put in front of her, the toys that we buy, the dolls that she have, very intentional about supporting who she is as a Black girl, because I don't want anybody to tell her that she's not beautiful, or that she needs to straighten her kinky hair, or she needs to lighten her skin, or her nose is too broad. Like me and her dad have to, consistently pour those images and those messages back into her that says, you are enough. You have everything that you need. You are beautiful. Like and having our village continuously pour those messages in as well.
That's good, Charlotte. You mentioned an intergenerational experience of affirmation, right? And how that usually comes from the household. And you even looked at it geographically and said, when you think about the country of Jamaica versus the States, and how those two things can look differently. But they both can be touched even by white supremacy culture. And this idea of what it means to be Black, both based off of dark skin or light skin, or in the States, that and compared to more Caucasian folks as well. Powerful conversation. Charlotte, you started us off real deep and rich.
Come on,
I don't know
let's go. Come on, panel.
Go ahead, Hope.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I just was gonna share that listening to the piece where we're talking about, I think you mentioned, Jeremy, something about single parent family homes and how that can help aid to the adultification process. And like a caveat that I want to say is, like, obviously that's a generalization, but I do want to share that, like, having I grew up with a single parent in a single parent home, and there were just like a lot of skills and things that I either were expected to know or like had to know. So that piece about learning how to cook was something that came very early, like, and this is especially since I had a grandma who grew up in the South, and she had lost her mom at a young age, so she was expected to actually raise her siblings. And so that's kind of what she expected. There was kind of this autonomy that was expected of me, and not necessarily my brother. So I learned how to cook and sweep and all this stuff when I was like 10, and I would get really specific critiques about, you're not sweeping well enough, or like, just like very, there was an expectation that I was going to do these things that adults can do and do them well as early as possible. But then there's a piece about policing bodies. Like, I hit puberty at 11, and so I developed really early. And the conversation about my body was mostly centered on like how other people viewed me and not a conversation about how I viewed my body. And so oftentimes like I would pick clothes that I really liked or liked, like tank tops, especially. I really like tank tops, but unfortunately, like I was more developed in my breast area, so I had a larger chest size, and like there was immediate policing. You can't wear that. People are going to think X, Y, and Z, or like a lot of concern about the gazes I would get from like men or other people as well. So there was just like a lot of policing and training in how I would be perceived on the outside that I got growing up as messages around like my Black femininity.
Wow. One of the things I appreciate, use the word policing and training. That's a really powerful image when you talk about how we, from your lived experience, in so many ways, some Black girls can be trained to see their bodies a certain way, or at least from the perspective of other people. I loved how you talked about how it's important, at least what I got from what you were saying, is that it's important for us to teach Black girls to own their own bodies and to really make choices in autonomy for their own bodies, as opposed to being policed as well. That's good, Hope. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I can go next. I think for me, it's easier to answer the question of things I did not see growing up, or like messages about Black girlhood that I did not receive.
Understood.
Context. My mother's biracial. So most of the time I spent, like, basically I always tell folks I was like raised by white women, because with my mom being biracial and working a lot, I often was with my aunt and my cousins. So, and I went to a predominantly white elementary school. So when I was growing up, I did not get messaging from television, school, anything that Black girls were smart, that they were powerful, that they were pretty, that they were kind. And furthermore, when thinking about Black femininity, I did not receive messages that Black girls were tender, that they were soft, that they were emotional. It always was more so like Black girls are sassy, they have an attitude, or they want too much, or they're bossy, or they're loud, or these kind of messages. Because you see that not only in television, but you know, like you see it in the absence, the lack of representation as well. And so first and foremost, with that being stated, there is nothing wrong with Black girls being loud or bossy or demanding respect. I want to stress that the issue is not the representation itself, because when you think of like particularly representation like that, a lot of people will be like, it's because Black girls are ghetto or from the hood. Hood Black girls deserve the world. So first and foremost, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that representation. It's just not the full picture. It doesn't tell the full story.
Beautifully said, Mikey.
Thank you. Part of it is from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's the problem with the single story, where she talks about stereotypes, right? Where she's like, there's nothing wrong with stereotypes. They're just not full. They don't tell the whole truth. They don't talk about, you know, any of the systemic stuff that's happening in the background. You just see it this one way. And I think that ties back to the statistic, right? About Black girls needing less protection, about Black girls being less nurturing. Because that goes back even as far as like enslavement, right? Of Black women being deemed as more masculine, or not being able, or like to handle more pain. And that trails even into today, right? Where, you know, you look at rappers like Megan Thee Stallion, who she's tall,
oh my gosh,
she's gorgeous, and like, I love Megan Thee Stallion. But after she was assaulted and shot, the internet just ran and just like made a joke of it, not considering the fact that like, this was a woman who had been harmed, and that, you know, could feel and have feelings, and, you know, like how that trauma continues. It's because often we strip Black women, especially Black girls, of that ability to be tender and soft, compared to their white peers. So yeah, I hope I that was a lot. Sorry for rambling, but
No, Mikey, you're right on time. We have been exploring many of those concepts for the last 7 months. So we're used to having those kinds of dialogues, looking at both the historical context that really shape how we engage with each other through microaggressions and stereotypes. All of that stuff is really super connected. I appreciate you really making that that connection for us. While Tiana's speaking, do you mind putting the link to that book in the chat box for folks? That's good stuff. Thanks for being resourceful, Mikey.
So I think I'm going to echo a lot of what's been said already. I think about what Charlene is saying, the messaging, the images within media that kind of let me know that, oh, this is kind of the standard, this very Eurocentric standard.
Yeah.
But I do remember seeing Dominique Dawes, this amazing Black woman gymnast, and wanting to be her. But realizing that I probably had to start being a gymnast at like 3 years old. I just can't grow up and do a flip. I had to do it. But those images, and I think about messaging around my hair when I was young. And so I remember getting my hair pressed before important holidays, especially like Easter, sitting next to the stove and the hot comb, ear being burned,
the
kitchen in the back, but also the dialogues my mother had with my grandmother regarding putting a perm in my hair, and like not wearing my hair in its natural state, and that something was wrong with that. Like, you need to put a perm, in her hair. And eventually I did get a perm, but then I grew it out just because it's like, this isn't working for me. So that's one messaging around my hair that's just really vivid. And then also when I went to cut my hair, some family members like, why you do that? Or if I had dreadlocks, why you do that? Well, I guess not really understanding why this was such a big thing for me. The second thing that I thought about, and I thought about this last night regarding this question, there was this one event, many events, but this one event that stood, and that's just it's still vivid. I used to I was in the 220 program for 2 years within my K through 12 tenure. And the 220 program, for those don't know, it was the push to desegregate schools within, I guess, Wisconsin. And so basically Black kids could be bused out to the suburban schools for kind of a better education. And so I was at Benjamin Franklin in Menominee Falls for 2nd and 3rd grade. For 2nd grade, I was one of 3 Black kids in my class, and 3rd grade, I was one of 2. And so in 2nd grade, like when it was snowing outside, there will be plows that will have different snowbanks. They would gather the snow, put it in the snowbank, and then the school provided sleds. So like at recess, we could, have fun and sled. And we will always try to finish our lunch very early so we can be one of the first people to get a sled.
Of course.
And so I didn't have a lot of friends. Yeah, there were 2 other Black kids in my class, and we were cool, but I didn't have a lot of white friends there at all. Made fun of all of that stuff. So this particular day, it was snowbanks, and I'm mapping out like, yes, I'm about to eat my lunch, get my sled, and I'm gonna have fun sledding down these little snowbanks. I did that, sled down, but like the second time around, so finished my lunch, went outside with the sled down one of the snowbanks and literally busted my lip.
Wow.
Went to the nurse. The school did not call my mother at all. I was not given any kind of like medical attention, like, okay, all right, busted lip, all right, just kind of go back to class. When I got off the bus and I went back home, I went through the door and started crying right away, because I had to sit, like, this is lunchtime, this is the afternoon. So I had to sit through in class. Imagine being in class, busted lip, you're not calling my family member. So I have to just sit there. And my mother was like, why didn't somebody call me? And literally have to call the school and almost say some choice words because you didn't call me and tell me that my daughter had busted. And it was huge. Like I had to go to the emergency room.
Oh, wow.
And so right there, I'm just like, what is this about the thinking that I don't need care or comfort? I'm a second grader. I am a second grader. You know how old second graders are? Like, and to sit through class for the rest of the day with a busted lip, how does that impact my learning? And you're not even trying to get in contact with a family member. So that continues to stay with me anytime. And I work with students anytime people don't go the extra mile to make sure Black girls are cared for and they have kind of what they need.
Wow. Yeah, that's an unfortunately, potentially really common experience. And now we know statistically for Black women to assume that the Black women can endure pain at higher rates than white women. And I think someone mentioned it earlier, but there's a book called The Medical Apartheid that is a powerful, powerful book that really speaks to the historical apartheid that Black folks' bodies have experienced from slavery. So if you're ever wondering how and why there's still so many medical practices that exhibit bias, right? We talked about the opioid epidemic, and there's a research done around how and why at the beginning, so many African-American people did not get caught up in that opioid epidemic as much. And I remember seeing a presentation at Independence First, and they talked about how there's still this bias amongst doctors that Black folks can endure more pain. So they're less likely to prescribe us medications for pain than there are white counterparts. And so that overprescription for white folks and that underprescribing for Black folks is what created this gulf at the beginning of the opioid epidemic based off of race. And so all of those things really tie together. So thank you, Tiana. Unfortunately, as a young Black girl, you had to experience that. Okay. So our panelists have taken us through some enriching highs and lows when it comes to really sharing about life experiences. And I want to honor those as well. Thank you all for sharing that. But I also want to make room for the audience here to get into this conversation. Are you all thinking about anything? Is there any questions you'd like to ask? Please speak when you feel moved.
I was just, Tiana, your story I'm sorry, I'm a little teared up. It just spoke to me being somebody who, is an educator. And I just feel like I feel angry because I guess, again, being somebody who hasn't experienced this, sometimes it's not made apparent to you. You know, like, again, like I don't have the perspective. So I appreciate you all coming and sharing your perspectives, first of all, because I feel like I'm really learning a lot. But then I could also see when you said that your mother had to call and give them some choice words, I could see like a school district then utilizing that into more furthering the stereotypes where your mother shouldn't have had a call. Your mother, they should have communicated that. But I could just see a situation where then they're like, oh, you see, she called and she got angry. But it's like any mother would do that. So I just want to thank you for sharing the story. And that's all I really have to say. It just hit me emotionally.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak?
Yes, this is kind of unrelated, but over all the months of taking this training, it has impacted me significantly, and I am so grateful for this education. And I think that we all, white people, need this desperately if anything is really going to ever change. And I am appalled and infuriated and saddened that as school districts are trying to implement education about these topics, they are facing so much backlash, and it makes me feel very discouraged because this is such important information that we need to know in order to heal ourselves, our culture, our world, and it's just not looking positive.
Yeah, Patty, you mentioned something really powerful in that as we continuously expose the lived realities of marginalized folks, white folks who are used to being centered in every aspect of society push back. And you all have heard me say this over the last couple of months, just because you're not the focus of the conversation doesn't mean you're not in the conversation, right? And so for 2 hours, potentially a month, depending on how often you take these kinds of trainings, white folks are not the center of the conversation. And that can make some white folks feel like they're being erased because they're not used to sharing space, right? And so when we talk about equity and or inclusion, we're talking about valuing the lived experiences of everybody, not just a few folks, and not allowing a few people's lived experiences to dominate the conversation and the narrative. So it's powerful. Yes, we understand that. And I want to encourage all of the white folks on this call as we continuously do our work, that you all continuously be in that fight. We never want to burden folks of color with the responsibility to respond, react, and intervene to white supremacy culture. As we continuously create safe spaces like these to talk, that's going to give you all more tools in your tool belt to begin to address racism and white supremacy culture as well. That's the work that you have. I remember someone said on social media one time, the burden of living under racism is far greater than the burden of white folks having to dismantle racism. And so you have to remember that context as well. There have that generationally and globally, folks are living under the oppression of racism. And it's white folks' turn to really start saying, you know what, we're going to take all this growth, all this information, and really dismantle those ideas and those constructs as well. So thank you for sharing that, Patty. Anyone else? Thoughts, comments, questions?
I have a thought, Jeremy. I thought about a time when my daughter was registering her kids at school. I lived in Wauwatosa. She lived in Wauwatosa, to the extent that the secretary couldn't believe that that was our address, that she literally took it upon herself to call the manager of the apartment that we lived in to make sure that we lived in Wauwatosa. So, and my thing is this, we had to take it so far that this lady could never speak with my daughter again because of the way she dealt with her during that time. Now, I like to know what are the schools doing, or what's the school board doing to manifest some training in that area of the way they treat us, Blacks, different than whites, different than Asians, and just so much different. And so I like to know what type of training are they getting to educate them and de-escalate what they learned maybe 50 years ago. I don't know, but we all come up with our own ideas and the way we were raised and stuff. But sometimes, when are we going to change? How long is it going to take to change? And I know it doesn't come overnight, but it hasn't been overnight. It's been hundreds of years to try to make some of these changes. And then two, when are we going to learn that we have to talk to our kids, our Black kids, about different things? But certain things your parents didn't talk about back in my day, in the 50s and 60s. And then it was some things you say, well, I'm going to make sure I tell my kids all of this stuff. And then the way life changed with, now you don't have the two-parent home anymore when you used to have a two-parent home. And so now you have to work and you don't have time. You think that you're going to have time to sit down and discuss things with your kids, but now you don't, because you have to get out there, not only work one job, but two jobs, because the cost of living is so high and you trying not to live in poverty. You want to live somewhere halfway decent. You know what I'm saying?
Yep, I understand.
So when are we going to start making those changes, and how do we get there with the schools, the jobs, when you go shopping? You know, I still have folks coming up to me, you know, can I help you? Or I can look at somebody and tell they want to come and say something to me, but they're not quite sure if they're going to be receptive or not.
Gotcha.
Okay, just a comment.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ruby. I think you listed up a few things. Family dynamics have evolved in today's society, and in a lot of ways, and to include different forms and types of families, which is also a really good thing. Sometimes when we talk about single family homes, we talk about it in a strictly negative context or narrative, which is not necessarily, in a lot of cases, not the truth. There are a lot of young people who exist in homes where their parents don't necessarily live in the same space, but they feel loved, protected, and adored all the same, right? And so what I love about what you're saying, Ruby, is that generationally, you've noticed so many things may still be the same, but we can also speak to the fact that so many things have been achieved. So many things have also changed, right? To not only be more inclusive, different forms of representation, as Mikey talked about, but literally legislative changes as well that have really helped to shape the lives of folks who live marginally historically in a much better way. And so everything from the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, but even more in the 2000s, where you have even other states talking about making it illegal for school districts to mandate that certain Black children have their hair look a certain way. There's different industries talking about even the news industry allowing for or even dismantling the idea that women of color have to wear straight hair just to be an anchor, right? So there are incremental changes that still exist. And it's going to be important for us as a collective to hold up both of those realities, right? To hold both of those histories up while respecting the journey that we still have, that we still are on. And so, Ruby, you just remind me that that history of things still being the same is true, but then also that history of things evolving has happened incrementally as well. And it does us a great deal of service to hold true those things that have positively changed, because a lot of times that's how we're going to stay in this fight. That's how we're going to keep doing this great work, is also collecting those wins, right? And sometimes because the bigger picture hasn't changed, we may forget that the small things have changed as well. And so those things must be collected. And Ruby, you actually bring us to the next part of our conversation, in which you talked a lot about those institutional things that still remain the same. You know, when we talk about different industries, we've all been given so many statistics around how African-American folks have been treated in different industries like the prison industrial complex and academic circles and universities, whether it be in schools or not. And rather than wake you all down with those statistics, what I'd rather do is really speak to the panelists around what it means and how Black women and or girls are really treated in these institutions. And so our next question is going to be for the panelists. How are Black women and girls treated differently in these different systems? For example, the judicial system, workplaces, schools, and hospitals. And if you'd like to speak to, after this question, we'll actually end the conversation on what are some of those solutions interpersonally and systemically as well. All right, so panelists, who'd like to start us off? Ruby got us to this place where we're now talking about some of those institutional biases as well. And you can even speak to some of those institutional opportunities. Maybe you all know some organizations or some individuals who are countering those institutional biases as well. Feel free to speak to that. Would anyone like to start us off with talking about how Black girls specifically are treated differently in institutions?
I would like to, just because I have like some specific anecdotal experiences.
Go ahead.
But I think Tiana kind of brought it up when she was talking about like her experience of having her lip busted and like not being treated as if she was in pain. Like this idea of pain tolerance in Black women is something that has been codified in medicine to a degree. Obviously, I know that there's been a lot of work and research to kind of walk a lot of those findings back, findings in quotations, but like I personally have experienced just a lot of trauma in the institution of medicine in terms of like getting care. I just vividly remember like going to the doctor after having a pretty traumatic school accident where I like fell off of the school bus, which is a different story, but like I fell down the stairs and went to the doctor to get my back x-rayed, and along the lines of like these intersectional like cross-cutting pieces, instead of the doctor addressing like the pain that I was experiencing after falling down the stairs and having my back hurt, he was basically just like, you need to lose weight. Wow. Like that was the advice. It was like, you're in pain because you're fat, you need to lose weight. And this was when I was like 13. So the fact that the doctor thought that that was okay to say to like an adolescent was problematic. But then also like as an adult going through a very common issue amongst like Black women, which is like fibroid tumors, I had to go to 4 different doctors and they were all saying a generalized version of the same thing, which is like pain during your menstruation is normal and there isn't anything you can do except for taking ibuprofen. And it wasn't until I went to a specialist that was recommended by a white colleague of mine, 2 hours away, where they actually looked into the issue and found out that I had like a few fibroids that were making things very uncomfortable for me. So this issue of like medical insensitivity and like, I don't even know what to call it because it's not ignorance. It feels very like willful and determined, like ignoring of Black women's pain in the medical field, is an issue that I've just been closely acquainted with.
Thank you for sharing, Hope.
To piggyback off of that, I work at a university, and this is in line with how Black women are treated differently. So I work at a university and predominantly white institution, so it's not easy for Black students on this campus. So I was talking with a colleague one day, and we were just talking about students and different things that they go through, especially when they're within resident life, if they're living on campus. And she made a point to say that, you know, the Black students, they're so resilient. Like a lot of the issues that we have, you know, like drinking and all of these very kind of interesting issues that students do or behaviors that they have on this campus are the white students. Like, and she was like, but they're just so, like the Black students is almost like, you know, people think they're the ones doing all of these, you know, infringements or breaking the rules and whatever, but it's really the white students, and the Black students are so resilient. And on one end, I can say, yes, they are. But on the other end, it's like, and they still need care. Like, so there's this expectation that because, that's what I got from it. There's this expectation that because the Black students are so resilient, I don't really need to pay too much attention to them because they're coming in, they have, you know, the weight that you talked about, Jeremy, going, you know, if you're first gen, especially if you're first gen, all of these things. And then, so that's one thing. So they're so resilient that I don't need to worry about them. They're just gonna push through and they're gonna get it done. Okay, wow. They're gonna push through, they're gonna get it done. And the second thing is there were groups of students who were pushing to get a Black counselor on campus in the counseling center. to the point where one of the students came to me and they met with student affairs staff or administration. And they said, and of course, maybe hearsay or whatever, I don't know, but I'm going to believe students, Black students. They were like, well, we can't find a Black counselor. And I was just like, really? There's a whole bunch in Milwaukee. But this constant push, and even recently I heard that an administrator even said that, Black students need to understand they don't need a Black counselor.
Wow.
What? And so these things of resilience and then the mental health of Black students, especially within the setting, I'm talking real specifically within the setting I'm in within academia, is extremely important. And I just see tons of ways that Black students are just treated differently, or not like really ushering in like the different resources that they would need. And so I just thought that was so interesting that we comment so much on the resiliency of Black women, to the point where we don't need to really worry about them because we know that they're, the strong Black woman, narrative, that we don't really need to worry about them. But in fact, we kind of do. Like, if they have this weight, if we're talking about this weight, and you have students who may be a mother, you have students who have other familial responsibilities, so they are possibly working, even if they're not, just being on campus on a predominantly white institution. They got goals and they trying to get through. Yes, they're resilient, and they also need care too. So how can we? So I mean, that's what came to mind as Hope was talking about her experience, and then I just think about some of the Black girls, young Black women experiences on campus in academia.
Yeah, Diana, a lot of times folks confuse resiliency with surviving racism. Like, those aren't mutually exclusive, right? My ability to live despite all of this oppression is not the same as me being resilient in my own life, okay? That's critical. And many times, especially in the academic world, if we talk about grit, if we even talk about social emotional learning, many times those things don't do justice to pulling out the lived experiences and separating what it means for me to be resilient or have grit in everyday circumstances versus what it means for me to live despite of intentional and institutional oppression, right? Those are two different things. And many times when we infuse the two, then we find ourselves saying, well, Black folks, representation doesn't matter in all contexts. But what you're talking about is representation that matters for the context of surviving the oppression of universities. There's a difference there, right? So when you look at the historical context of universities and how they've treated folks of color and how they can manifest over history, folks need to be able to lean on each other, confide in one another, and really contextualize their lived experiences in every institution. Why? Because every institution was actually rooted in white supremacy culture. Okay? And so therefore, you have to always make room, create space, and accountability toward an equitable space for folks who have been historically marginalized, especially in those institutions. Tiana, that's a really powerful point. And that distinction is something that can be really hard to create nuance for, but it's important. Wow. Okay, so we had Hope talking about the institution of the medical field. Tiana chimed in with University of Charlotte and Mikey. Did y'all want to speak to those conversations or even a different institution about lived experiences that Black girls may have?
I kind of want to talk about both.
Do your thing, Mikey.
So I grew up in a very sex positive home, and I'm so grateful for my mom for that. I had a very shame-free household. Like, my mom very much was like, if you have questions, I want you to ask them. Because in her mind, She was like, I would much rather you come to me and ask a question and it's just embarrassing and awkward than like something happens and it's like a bigger deal. And so I am thoroughly grateful to my mother for that, because not only has that benefited me in my upbringing, but all of my homies can talk to my mom about sex or pleasure or anything else too.
Oh, you had that mom, Mikey.
I had that mom. Jennifer Black is a real one. But I think for me that was so important. And then when I got to high school and was in a sex ed class my sophomore year, the health class that I was in was debatable, but that's not the point. One day in class, our teacher was like, I want you to raise your hand if you can go home after class today and talk to your parents about sex. And only me and one other person raised our hand.
Wow.
And so I'm thinking a lot about that. I'm thinking a lot about how just educationally and medically we don't talk about sex enough, just even as a culture, but how that particularly harms Black girls and just Black folks in general is because one, it's that adultification thing, right? Like you assume Black girls know about sex. So then if Black girls go out and have unprotected sex or sex in which like, you know, boundaries or consent is like murky, like there's just a bunch of things in that in which it's the lack of information, the lack of care, and the assumption like, okay, well, you know, they already know because of like the internet, or, you know, just Black women are just inherently more sexual. And so I think of those things and how they all play a big role. Black folks in particular, there's, when it comes to like health disparities, like I believe with chlamydia, in 2018, there is a survey that like Black folks were like 9 times more likely to be exposed to chlamydia.
Yeah.
So just things like that, right? Like you think of like this lack of education just across the board because of just how us as a culture respond to sex.
Oh, I get what you're saying, Mikey.
Because you assume Black girls already know what's going on. And so we are denying them the opportunity to make safe, informed decisions about their bodies. And also the idea of like shaming Black girls for their sexuality and making it so that like you already either assume and you slut shame and all that stuff, but then also the flip side of that too, where it's like, I don't want other people to see you as sexual. I don't want you to think of yourself as sexual. And then what happens in sexual situations where you're like, I don't know what is going on, or like this doesn't feel right, but I can't articulate why it doesn't feel right, or I have no one who I can articulate that to, and how that can be complicated. I thankfully, like, you know, again, with like my mom, with my OBGYN, with Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, when it came to things like STD testing, like I was able to have like those kind of open conversations. But I just keep thinking back to that first slide where it was like, Black girls know more about sex than their peers. And I was like, that's not true. That is not true. Because we're all in the same schools, getting the same sexual education. And then you throw on the like intersection of like race and gender, and how that plays a role. And then sexual orientation too, because I could go on a whole spiel about how I didn't learn about queer sex until I was in college, like as a queer person, like just things like that. So yeah, I'm gonna step off my soapbox because I really could talk about this for 2 hours by itself. But that's just something I wanted to talk about as well, because that's just, I feel like we gotta take away the stigma of sex in order to benefit everybody.
Wow, Mikey. So one of the things, I just had an aha moment in that it is what I hear you saying, that the stereotype is what manifests the injustice, right? The idea that you either know a lot about it, so I won't educate you, is what creates this assumption and then this treatment as well. So when we talk about patriarchy and we talk about sexism and we talk about anti-feminism, right? All of those things are rooted in this sense of masculinity and power and privilege. And the idea that you get shamed for owning and understanding your bodies, number one. And then your sexuality, number two. And then your gender expression, number three. All of those things are oftentimes policed in patriarchy and sexism. And so it kind of has this double-edged sword. you find yourself potentially ignorant to the conversation, and then having experiences and or learning moments later on that could potentially have been much more positive if you have been equipped with the information. And then secondly, the oppression or the systemic injustice comes in where now folks are putting onto Black women, if I hear you correctly, folks are putting onto Black women these ideas around what it means to be sexually active, and these expectations that are oftentimes conflicting and dehumanizing to who you are as a person who has sexual choices and autonomy. Wow. Wow. That's good. Told y'all this panel is not playing. It is 10:21 in the morning on Friday. And we could stop now, but we will not. We're going to get all this loving from these Black women, and we're going to keep this conversation going. Is there anybody else on the panel who'd like to speak to that institutional oppression and or institutional differentiation in how Black women and girls are treated?
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely take it from a different perspective. I loved hearing about, there's so much experience and perspective with these women on this panel that I'm just like, yes, I could just sit here and listen to you all day. Seriously. It's just one of those things where, you sometimes don't get that space to be, affirmed and to be like, yes, I'm not crazy. Yes, that happened to you too, right? So, just thank you all so much for your experiences. But I'll just add a different lens when we talk about, the work that we've Urban Underground and Youth Justice Milwaukee has been doing centered around justice involved girls. So now I'm taking it from the standpoint of our judicial or our justice system and how our girls are treated in that system. And we think about, first of all, there are not a lot, there are more boys in our justice system than there are girls. And so it's interesting when we think about, Black girls particularly, the numbers are pretty low, but because they're not relevant experiences or options for them. Typically, what I've heard judges say is, look, if a girl is being sex trafficked, to keep her safe, we have to lock her up, to make sure that she has the things that she needs. There are no options to make sure that she's able to have the resources that she needs in the community. So we have to lock her up. And that's been the sentiment on the justice side for a lot of our girls, particularly our Black girls, because of the lack of options and opportunities for them. Yeah. Now, when we talk about what's, really out there, we really haven't put the resources into formalizing opportunities that work well for Black girls, right? And I'll give you a quick example. If I have, let's say, 5 girls in a group home, I'm gonna use 6 girls in a group home setting. Okay. Right? You may have 1 bathroom. Strike 1. When you listen, it's just, I'm a family of 5, and it's me and my daughter, and we have 1 bathroom, and that's a problem, right? So thinking about the needs of young girls, we haven't come to, and again, also asking them, but just looking at data, having their needs met by having, the spaces for them to, have the tools, I'm in the mirror doing my hair. I want to take time in the shower, whatever, right? Having those sorts of options. Also, group homes that are not, some of our group homes are not in community. So they buy hair products that are not relevant to or even girls that are locked in detention center or jailed prisons. And, the hair products are not tailored to us culturally. So it's those sorts of, policies and practices
Wow.
that could simply say, you know what, we're going to get rid of the group home model because it doesn't work. Instead of co-housing young people, girls particularly, in these sorts of environments, we're going to say, you know what, some people may have heard professional foster care. Let's pair one girl, girl of color with a family. And in that way, we won't get into the issue of girls running away from group homes, girls running away from staff secured, facilities, because they're not, they're not running into problems. They're trying to run away from problems. This is causing me more harm or distress than, and it's just better for me to just be out on the street or just for me to figure it out, right? So using just the life experiences of our girls to say, you know what, we have a system in every single area. We've talked about medical, we've talked about education, we've talked about sexuality. Like, let's continue and begin to ask girls, what is it that you need? We're not listening. We're not attending to the needs of Black girls in particular, because of all the things that, our wonderful panelists has shared and how you have framed it up, Jeremy. We have, lived in this sort of white supremacist sort of culture that doesn't humanize and doesn't provide that context and the gifts that our children bring to the table. It's simple, of just respect. How do we humanize and how do we respect our girls at a place of where it is that they are? And the article that I just dropped in, where the young lady was, forced to take out her beads, and she had to actually cut them out of, her teammates had to help her cut them out of her hair, right? This is what we have done, to children. And at the end of the day, I know this conversation spans across children to young women to adults. Like, this is something that permeates our society that we have to begin to have more conversations around.
Wow. Yes. One of the things I love, Charlene, is I've never heard anyone talk about folks who are detained and or incarcerated in that way before. And the humanity that is oftentimes lost in the statistics that we choose to share is astounding. Wow. The fact that you don't get to share the impact of sharing the same bathroom, and how that in many times conflicts with your need to continue to develop as a young girl. Jeez. Man. Wow. That's real. I love the humanity you've brought back to the conversation around justice that is oftentimes stripped away from folks. As you were talking, all of the thoughts around why folks who are in the justice system don't deserve pop into my head. These ideas around how you don't deserve, you're in the justice system, you don't deserve good shampoo. What? You're in the justice system, you don't have to be comfortable in spaces where you have to make choices around your body. Please, you're in the justice system. You're in the justice system. Don't nobody care about if this, if that. There's all of these, the criminalization of Black and brown folks, especially young girls in the justice system, is inhumane. And like you said, then you get judged for trying to run away from the re-traumatization of it all. Then it becomes criminal to say, I no longer want to endure that level of humanity. Wow. Okay. Is there anyone from the audience who'd like to speak? Share your thoughts as well. Please speak when you feel moved.
It also makes me think about the blaming that occurs with women and girls who are victims of sexual violence. And if we compound that with the messages of Black girls are tougher, or, you know, how we have kind of fetishized the notion of being fierce, and fierce is good, but if you're too fierce, then you're a fast girl, and fast girls are begging for it. It's just like this really sick loop that in the end, you know, I fear that, you know, women and girls are then internalizing like, well, I deserved this violence, and they're not going to come forward. And so how many instances of violences are happening that we are totally unaware of because we have removed that platform or that safety net for people who have been victimized.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carol. Is there anybody else? Anybody who hasn't spoken yet who'd like to add to the conversation at all? I want to make room for you all to choose to speak if you like. So for our next piece, thank you all for that. That was our second question. First question was around what are some of the messages you received as a Black girl? The second one was around how are Black girls treated disproportionately in different institutions and around different conversations. Thank you all for adding to that. And for this last 30 minutes, we're going to talk more toward the solutions, more toward what we can do interpersonally and institutionally to really begin to address our own biases and also really create equitable spaces for Black girls. And so I'll provide you all with a few things that I've come up with as well. And then we'll shoot it back to the panelists to talk about it from their perspective. And then if there's any final questions around it or things of that nature, how to create equitable spaces for Black girls, think about that in your head as we're talking. I want this audience to really think through what are some questions you have around how to create equitable spaces for Black girls wherever you're engaging with Black girls in your lives, okay? All right, y'all, this is the last part of our esteemed learning panel. I'm excited to get into some of those solutions as well. And so for this next piece, I have an excerpt to close out our conversation around institutional bias from a Black woman. It says, I wonder if this is a cyclical way of it playing out, speaking to the generational transfer of surviving oppression. Like if you are a Black woman or child and you have experienced the impact of making a mistake, or like you're perceived by the external world and you don't feel that you could make a mistake, then you're going to feel you're passing wisdom and strength onto your daughter to have them be able to endure the same things. Remember when we talk about the difference between having grit and then enduring oppression, right? And so to me, it seems like it plays out in a child. In parenting, it's the passing on love for me to tell you, like, pretty much, you're going to be perceived this way. And so this particular excerpt speaks from the voice of a Black woman who is in part saying many times Black women are told who they are from the rest of the world and how they should feel about themselves, particularly around making mistakes and making choices. And sometimes in a survival mechanism, Black women may teach their daughters certain ways of surviving in the world. And it can feel like you're giving them a loving instruction on how to really endure this oppression, right? And so that particular conversation is important because many times in order to survive historic oppression and current day oppression, we have to tell our children different things that allows them to stay alive, not necessarily gives them more dignity or creates a more safer space for them, but literally fundamentals of just staying alive is many times the kinds of conversations we're having with Black children. And so it's going to be important for us to expand on that conversation and create a world where Black parents can have a different kind of conversation with their Black children. One that is not rooted in simply surviving, but one that can evolve itself into thriving in this world, okay? So when we talk about solutions, a few frameworks to think about. Let's say you're an organization or you're working with a group of Black folks, and you're thinking to yourself, man, I really have to begin to think about these things differently. A few things you can say to yourself is, or ask yourself is, are we expanding ourselves? There's a lot of predominantly white organizations who have been working exclusively with white folks for a long time. And it may be difficult for you to think about, where do we go and become more inclusive? Always ask yourself, are we expanding ourselves? Notice who you give the benefit of the doubt to and who you are more critical of. Maybe you're doing business with somebody and you always do business with white folks because you've always done that, even though they may be late, even though they may be unprofessional at times, even though they may be forgetful. But then you go and you look at Black businesses and you go, we're not going to do that because they're late or they're unprofessional. Many times we give the benefit of the doubt to folks who look like us and or folks who have power and privilege, and we don't do that. We don't also exercise that grace for folks who have lived experience and oppression or marginalized identities. And so are we expanding ourselves is a really good question to ask folks who have power and privilege. How can I expand myself to seeing new people, expand myself to work with other folks? Thinking about yourselves and knowing that you should be more empathetic. Okay, asking yourself what external factors might affect other people that I'm not aware of. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Sometimes we call someone's choices based off a character flaw. The reason she did that is because she's careless. The reason she did that is because she's grew up in a single family home. Whatever it may be, we start pointing the finger at people and saying, you're a bad person, which is why you made those choices. As opposed to being empathetic and saying and recognizing the role systems play in folks' ability to make equitable choices for themselves. That's going to be critical. We might be in our own way. And a lot of mostly white institutions or institutions that experience a lot of power and privilege, a lot of times your worldview is what keeps you from being able to both empathize with other folks of color and Black girls. And so you want to make a list of your own shortcomings. Many times what I found in leadership spaces, especially with folks who may be teaching Black youth, with folks who may be leading organizations with Black staff, is that they want to hide their own shortcomings. They want to make it appear as if they don't have those things. And when we talk about healing from harm done by oppression, a great place to start is for folks who have power and privilege to own up to how they may have done harm, own up to what things they may have in shortcomings, so that we can have a more equitable conversation around growth. And so interpersonally, you may be thinking to yourself, you know what, I am my own way. I'm not owning up to my shortcomings and challenges and struggles, and really speaking to what you can change about yourself. I mentioned this because many times in power dynamics, we'll make a mistake and ask other people to change. We'll do something and we'll be like, you know what, even though, we have a high rate of turnover amongst our Black employees, maybe we should get employees that have master's degrees instead of bachelor's degrees. That'll solve it. Even though we have a lot of Black folks complaining about historical racism, maybe they need to learn to do that on their personal time and stop trying to mix that liberation theology with their employment. They should change. And so a lot of times we do that oftentimes when we have power and privilege. I want to challenge those folks who exercise power and privilege and who exist in spaces where they have the power dynamic in their favor to always own up to what they can do differently. Figure out what it is, how you contribute to harm, as opposed to blaming other people for that harm. Is there something we can do more or differently? Asking others to give you feedback and offer suggestions for improving the way you communicate, behave, and make decisions. Many times, not only are we not willing to own up to some of the things we've done as an institution or a person with power and privilege, but we're also not creating equitable spaces for folks to offer feedback with a commitment for change. And so I want to encourage everybody on this call, if you are engaged with folks of color or marginalized identities, you have to really, the only reason you're asking for feedback is to make sure you can implement those suggestions and commit to actual change. You're not asking for feedback to get more knowledge. No, that's a waste of folks' time. We're not just asking for feedback because we feel bad. Nuh-uh, let's go deeper. Let's go further, right? Is there something we can do more or differently? Make it actionable. Whatever you give out that survey on equity or inclusion or whatever it is, make sure at the top of that survey, you tell folks exactly what you're going to use that information for and what you plan to change. Many times, people don't give you real information because they don't trust the results of the conversation. So you may be asking folks to tell you candidly, you know, what can we do differently? They may be looking at you going, are you going to do anything differently once you know? Because if not, I can keep that to myself, especially in professional spaces where folks don't want to risk their livelihood for telling you the truth. And so you really have to do these things on the left. Expand yourself, find empathy and understanding how folks are impacted by institutions, recognize that you too have shortcomings that you also have to be transparent about, and then always, always find a way to be actionable about that feedback as opposed to being reactional and acting for the feedback. Any questions or thoughts about those set of solutions? And panelists, did you all want to add to those things at all?
Nope, go Mikey.
So actually, I just want to slightly push back on the idea of empathy, and just frame it to maybe using a word like dignity instead.
Ooh, go ahead.
So, shameless plug, I'm dropping Ubuntu's website in the chat. So Ubuntu Research and Evaluation is where I currently work. We're an org of transdisciplinary, unapologetic Black women strategists, helping individuals and orgs basically like tackle anti-Blackness.
Yes.
And so one thing that I think is really important to stress is that like white folks cannot empathize with Black folks because they will never have that understanding. However, if you reframe it for dignity, it's that idea of I'm a human being, I'm worthy of self-respect, and I have worth, therefore you are also a human being and you should also have that worth, and navigating that way, because it's then fully understanding of I don't understand and I can't understand. However, because of recognizing one another's humanity, I'm going to go out of my way and honor your worth by doing, you know, any of these other things, and more, and like, you know, doing that research on their own as well. This work is messy. This work is hard, but also if you're really about creating a better world for Black folks, particularly Black children, especially our Black girls, you have to be uncomfortable. You have to be willing to sit in that mess and be uncomfortable. This work should never feel easy. It should never, ever feel like, well, I got my certificate, I'm anti-racist. Like, it should never feel that way. This is something that is forever ongoing. Every day we'll need to actively do this work to unlearn, because it's woven into all of us, especially white folks, because anti-racism, like true anti-racism, does feel like a loss of power and privilege, because to a degree it is. You are losing that power and privilege, but you're doing it because you want to like stand with humanity and better the world that we live in. So that was it. I just wanted to just kind of like reframe that second point just a little bit.
I love that reframing, and I'll definitely make that note for future references that we want to. And so, Mikey, what I hear you saying is to always approach folks with dignity, as opposed to saying that you should have empathy, because there's some experiences that you do not share and you will not understand. Woo, we're all taking notes. I told you this is a powerful panel. This is no games here. We're all taking notes. Okay. All right. Is there anyone else?
Respond by being like, just to make sure I'm understanding. Like, yes, I love that energy.
Perfect. Thank you. And
I would add that approach, instead of asking, is there something more, approach it as there is always something that we can do more or differently, point blank, period. Because sometimes I think in my experience, it's almost like people want a checkbox, and it's not a checkbox type of system. And so there's always something that you can do more or differently. And what happens when you don't have the feedback? Will that stop whatever progress? Will that stop, policy change? Like, hopefully it doesn't. And so I would say approach it as like always. No, we can always do something more or differently. And what I try to do just on a very, I feel like a small visual level, is when Black students, Black women, young Black women come through my office, to not entertain what my colleagues, or not entertain, but to call my colleagues out when they're talking about their behavior. So I have young Black women who come to my office. They are loud. They are, where's Tiana? Is Tiana here? I mean, I make sure that they are their full, however they want to show up selves. But then also push back on my colleagues and say, no, they're fine. Oh, they were kind of loud. They were fine, because these other white students who work in my office are equally loud too. And I don't hear you saying anything to them about that. And constantly also calling them out on, like, we're in a meeting and you are singling out this Black woman who, oh, you looks like, are something bothering you? Are you mad? But also this other white girl had a interesting look on her face too, and you didn't say anything. And so that's what little things that I try to do to make sure that they have the space to do my part, to make sure they have the space to be their full selves, because I know when they go out there, they don't have that. They go into the classrooms, constantly judgment, everything, all of that. So there's always something more. There's always something more, and there's always something different that you can do.
That's beautiful.
Jeremy, if I can just jump in and just add to what Tiana was saying, because it just made me think about that we're always in this constant state of learning, right?
Yes.
And, you only know what you know, right? And so it's important for us to be in a space to learn, whether we're Black women, whether we're white women, Asian women, Latina women, like, we're in a space to be able to learn and to grow. And I think if we diminish that, right, because when you know better, you do better, right? And that's that notion of Tiana acknowledging or just noticing, like, oh, wait a minute, you're doing this to this student, but you're not doing it to that student, right? And we have to, be in the word courageous comes to mind, for me, because there are times where we see something and we're like, ooh, that's wrong, but we're like, well, not my problem. And we turn and we go the other way, right? Or we're like, oh, I didn't see that, or I didn't hear that, or, whether it's the, sexist jokes or the, inappropriate, comment about, someone, like, we're learning how in today's society that we no longer have to look away. We no longer have to, oh, I didn't hear that, or, that's my boss, I really can't, correct them, right? And so, I think we've been positioned and have been just looking at today's society, looking at 2021 and saying, you know what? We are in a different space. How can we do things differently? And if I make a mistake, I'm sorry, that was my bad. Owning up, to that, and not expecting this level of, perfection, especially as, white folks are on here listening, like, we're not expecting perfection. We're expecting a level of, I hear you, I see you, I understand. You know what? I'm going to do better. And this notion of working on it, right? We are all a work in progress. And, again, that notion, when we know better, we just have to do better.
That's good, Charlotte. And I think one of the things we talked about in one of our last trainings is folks talk about anti-racism work, and it's this idea, and they show up with a framework of saying, I'm not racist, as opposed to being like, no, you grew up in a racist society. So the better approach is to explore where you see racism in yourself and to unlearn that racism continuously, right? And so that unlearning process, Ubuntu shares a document about beloved community. And beloved, oh, sorry, Mike, you don't step on your toes, but beloved community, a very small part of it talks about existing in reciprocity, right? And so one of the things that I loved about the document is that in reciprocity, in order to create equitable spaces, like you just said, Charlene, everybody has to understand they are a student and a leader at the same time, right? And so if I'm in a space, no matter what my role is, and I cannot be corrected, and I cannot be instructed, and I cannot learn continuously from all people in the group, then I've created an oppressive space. And I am perpetuating white supremacy culture, as we know it in our Western society, by saying that there's a hierarchy of intellectual power that's existing between us. And so therefore, I cannot be challenged. I cannot be questioned. We see that all the time in families, parents who say, don't question me. And it's a legitimate question. You're being smart mouth. No, it may be a smart question, and I may be smart, but I'm not, right? And so there's these power dynamics that exist that oftentimes preclude us from learning more, doing better, and owning our stuff in a way that really starts change. That's good. Did anyone else from the panel want to add to the conversation at all?
I don't have too much to add, but I think, especially when I'm thinking about my experiences in spaces with white folks or other people who hold some sort of institutional power or even just like individual power in these situations, there's a question about like repairing yourself and like how to do that. And so to use white people as an example, I've often had white people use like the marginalized person as a sounding board or as like a space for them to kind of regain their energy. And I just want to add that as we're exploring solutions and as you're doing your own continuous unlearning, again, to pull that quote that I heard, that is just a delicious quote. Just like making sure that you're finding your own spaces that aren't using marginalized folks as like your safety blanket or your like support net. Just because like, again, we mentioned like living through the oppression is harder than what it takes to undo it for the folks who have the power to undo that, the systems. And so like, making sure you're not putting any more of that strain or pressure on people is important.
Yeah, Hope, relieving folks from that undue burden of trying to figure out the very system that's already oppressing them. That's important. Okay.
One more thing, Jeremy, I'm sorry. Realizing for Black women, self-care is very important. So thinking about ways in which maybe your organization or your practices don't allow Black women to center their self-care is also thinking intentionally about that. So not only are they doing labor, they're in, these different spaces, just really thinking about that. And that's what I try to do with the students that work in my office. Start that now. Because when you get out there, it's not going to be all rosy. We live in a capitalist system. And so really thinking about your own practices and what grace you may not give to Black women on the job or in the organization that would allow them to refresh themselves, get the care that they need is very important to look at too.
Wow, it sure is. Thank you. Is there, so now I want to give, Mikey, go ahead. Go ahead.
I would be remiss if I did not say this. I think one thing that's super important for everyone to walk away with too is that even in like conversations about like anti-Blackness or civil rights or Black Lives Matter, Black girls are constantly left out of the conversation. So make sure that if you are in conversation with folks about that, you are explicitly talking about the harm that happens to Black women and girls as well. Hashtag say her name has even kind of been hijacked to being like say their names, and say her name was created with the intention of these are Black women who have been harmed by police or just by these different institutions. So again, if you have something that says say their names or anything like that, like you're not like a horrible person. That's something that I have been thinking about a lot, about how say her name was created with the purpose of Black women and girls, and how that's even starting to shift in conversation as well. That was it.
No problem. Thank you. I think you all are full of knowledge, as we've all witnessed. You all are full of passion for this work, and not only your lived experience, but everything else that you come with in your being is so powerful and invaluable. I thank you all so much for participating. I thank you all for sharing vulnerably, and I invite folks to fill out our feedback form as well. If you wouldn't mind just giving us feedback on what we can do better, particularly myself. So I want to allow everybody this time to kind of say their thank yous to our panelists, either through the chat and or voice them, and we'll be leaving you all at 11 o'clock. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your time.
We just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists for coming today. We really appreciate you speaking with everyone here, and just thank you so very much for being here today. And Jeremy, thanks so much for organizing, and we're looking forward to seeing folks back in 2 weeks at our last training session.